Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Feels a real shame to interrupt all your conversations because today, that is what it's all about today. A lot has happened since we were all here together at 10 a.m. How has your day been? Good. Lots of nodding, lots of smiling. I'm really looking forward to hearing all about it. Before we get on to our keynote speaker and our final speaker of the day, I just wanted to give a couple of final notes and a couple of thank yous and a couple of invitations as well. So very first, thank you to all of our speakers and all of our participants. We've had so many of you joining us online. We've had a packed house here in Manchester, and we really appreciate everyone's contributions and our amazing speakers and chairs who've brought some really interesting questions and discussions for us all to have. What should we be talking about next year and future events? As I said, so much of what we plan really comes from your suggestions. Right at this minute, an email is landing in your inbox with our evaluation form. So if you've taken something for today, or if you had a bit of a niggle or a frustration or something didn't quite make the mark, either way, we'd be so grateful, even if you just put a couple of thoughts on there. I really want to say a couple of thank yous as well to those behind the scenes. So the team here at the museum have been brilliant. Paul and the tech team, if you need tech teams, remote AV, these guys have been brilliant for us. I want to say thank you to Alan. Where's Alan? Here's Alan here. So I mentioned at the beginning of the day that we've been running the Communicate conference for over 20 years now. 3 years ago, Alan cornered me at our London event in the pub after and said, "You need to bring this to Manchester." Or maybe I cornered him and said, "Should we bring this to Manchester?" And he's been a real advocate. So if you are also based in the region and would also like to play a part in helping us find speakers, find stories, helping us find the people who should be getting bursary places here in the region and being part of it, we would love you to get more involved with what we do. I wanted to point out my team at the Natural History Consortium who have been working super hard to pull all this together, but mostly if you're sticking around after you'd like to know more about what we do, you're coming to the pub and would like to meet some other people, these are the people to speak to. Speaking of the, and well done to everyone. And speaking of the pub, if you are here with us in Manchester, and apologies online audience, I haven't yet figured out how to deliver a pint to everyone's individual house or office. But if you're here with us in Manchester, straight after, we're going to be going round the corner and we'd love to get you a soft drink, a coffee, or something much stronger if you prefer. So please do continue the conversations and the networking. Couple of invitations there and a couple of thank yous, but that's going to be all for me. It's a real honor to hand over the mic for our final speaker of our first day of Communicate. Ruth Levene is an artist and is doing amazing work and is going to tell you about some of that work and some reflections on Against the Odds. So if you can help me thank and welcome Ruth to the stage.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is that okay? Yep, okay. The short story is that the Sheffield Wheat Experiment have been growing small amounts or relatively small amounts of wheat in Sheffield for 6 years. And that's pretty much it. But I will go into a little bit more detail. Just to give you a sense though, I think the first 3 to 4 years were very much about reaching out widely and bringing people together. But more recently, in the last couple of years, it's been about a conscious scaling down and a conscious slowing down. And I think I'll pick up on that a little bit as the slides go on. This, as a confession, isn't the first wheat project that I've been involved with, strangely. Although I'm an artist, I've become a sort of specialist-ish in certain areas of water infrastructure, farming and education. But I just wanted to cite this early project, which was a collaboration with another artist called Anne-Marie Culhane and a farmer in Lincolnshire called Peter Lundgren. And the short story of that was that we brought together a collective of 42 people to financially invest in a 22-acre field of wheat that the farmer grew. And over a period of 1 year, which covered the time it took for the wheat to grow, so winter wheat is grown or sown in October and then harvested in August the following year, we went on a collective journey. And most of the people on the collective had some relationship, either directly or indirectly, with wheat growing, farming, or the local area. So together we shared knowledge, and we unpicked the understanding of how most of the wheat in this country is grown, the industrial system. And really it was this picture I wanted to put in because this was the final collective inquiry where we would kind of talk about different relationships with the system. But this is in a local Quaker meeting house, and this was really fundamental to the project. We worked with local Quaker elders to devise different ways of holding the conversation, because the people on the collective came from very different ways of thinking about what a food system should look like. So we knew it was quite a divisive conversation throughout the whole year. So it was very important that we wanted to help people listen and not necessarily have a conversation that was about winning. It was about exploring difference. So really it was a kind of deep dive, a collective deep dive in different knowledge systems and different understandings, and we touched on the historical, the economic, the environmental, the technical, and the cultural. And just to set up what I'm really going to talk about, which is the Sheffield Wheat Experiment, I think the one thing that was taken from this, because this happened between 2013 and 2016, so we had a kind of couple of years research period before the actual project. And really, if there was one summary that I could give you, it was like, you know, the culture has been stripped out of agriculture. And so what does it mean when our food systems are dominated by a language described as agri-tech or agri-business? What does it mean to live in a world where culture has been taken away, isolated, compartmentalized? So jump forward to 2020, and a group of us began talking about a kind of alternative project, which at the heart of it is the seed, and this is the wheat seed, and it is a diverse population. So I think there's been a few mentions of monoculture today. Most of the wheat that's grown is a monoculture, which means every single seed is the same variety. And most of that means that you can't sow it again. So when you harvest it, you can't take that seed and put it back in the ground to grow again. And that's how it's been for many, many, many years until relatively recently. But the seed that we're growing is a diverse population. Legislation in this country means that you can't grow this, really. You can grow it and possibly give it to bakers, but you can't grow it to bulk up for seed. So it's not part of the dominant system. As you can imagine, monocultures are bred to be utterly reliant on a current industrial kind of chemical input machine processing system, which has all of the devastating effects on the biodiversity around the farm, the soil health, and not to mention the nutrition and the chemicals found often in our bread. So population grains that we grow are a complete kind of alternative to this system, but as you kind of start to discover when you go into wheat, this isn't an isolated project. It's a fairly simple crop to grow in some respects, but you're utterly dependent on a kind of system. So you need the plant breeder, initially, but you also have the seed, you need the farmer to grow it, but then you need the miller, and then you need the baker, and then the bread looks pretty different from the bread that you might get in your local artisan bakery, as a sourdough maybe, white fluffy loaf, or a kind of, sliced packaged bread. So it means that you have to talk to people. It means that you have to bring people together. The other wonderful thing about this seed is the diversity means that we've been growing it 6 years, and each year we put it back in the ground. Some of the plants die out because they're not really suited to Sheffield, and some thrive. So over time, you start to adapt your seed to not only the land, but I would say the people and the place. So we are now truly developing a Sheffield wheat. So the concept of the work is that we create lots of miniature farms, which technically are different farms, i.e. people who wanted to grow wheat, we sent them a small package and gave them instructions how to grow it, which is essentially put it in the ground at a certain time. And then when the wheat was harvested, we showed them how to do it, and most of them were doing this by scissors because they were growing 1 to 5 square meters. And then the beauty was that we said, well, don't just do this on your own. Once you've harvested, come back and we'll all pull the wheat together, and then we'll process it, and then we'll redistribute it. And we did that for 4 years, and that's how we bulked up our seed. This was the first year's growth, map of Sheffield, so all the black spots are kind of little patches that were growing around the city. And the invitation went out with the seed, which was an invitation to care, share, tend, notice, connect, challenge, and change. So throughout that first year, we sent monthly newsletters. We gave different sort of technical advice of growing information. We shared ideas around wider food systems. We connected it to climate and carbon. And we had sort of the odd Wheat Wednesday where people could just drop in on Zoom. So this was 2020. So this was all done online, apart from the actual individuals growing. And of course, again, online in that year was very important. And so people just constantly posted pictures of their seed being sown and their wheat growing. So we didn't just have small we called them micro plots or micro growers. We also had a few larger plots, including the main one, which isn't this one, but a few market gardens and wider community projects who kind of gave a larger area a go. And the first year, by the time we got to the harvest and therefore the threshing event, so the threshing is the process, the name for the process by which after you've harvested it, you essentially have to get the seed out of the ears at the top. The technical term is any form of bashing it is how you get it out. And there's, many, many thousands of years of history of different variations of that. So we invited them. This is actually where my studio is, with a little gallery. And they all turned up, some with their sheaves on a bicycle, some walking through the town. And it was, for a lot of people, it was the first kind of public group event that they'd been to since lockdown, so it kind of had quite an energy to it. So they turned up, and as we did every year, they got their photo taken with their wheat if they wanted to. And this was quite an interesting process this first year. So we're always just only one step ahead, so we're learning. I mean, one of the reasons it was really important for us to call it an experiment was because we wanted it to be an experiment. We had no idea what we were really setting out to do. We knew some of the values, we knew what was wrong, we knew that there was an alternative system, but we've never consciously tried to implement that system in a kind of problem-solving kind of way. It was very much about being part of an experience together. We weren't sure about the logistics of how the threshing would work. And so we set these tables up here, mainly because there was only so much space, and the bulk of the bashing or threshing was done through traditional flails that one of our collective made for us. And that was a pretty big, violent act that even for us, we had to kind of do a little bit of risk assessment on. So we had, and only a few people could do it. So we had quite a lot of these tables which were essentially fine cleaning grain. So they all had white plates, little buckets of grain, and they were literally doing one grain at a time. This is completely unheard of in most systems, whether industrial or not industrial. But it became really, really important because it was a way to sit at a table and talk to people, or sit at a table and just completely zone out, but in a space where people were doing something for the same purpose, which was to pull that wheat back together to put it in the ground. We also had lots of spin-off projects over the years. This is Grizzly Grains Brewery, and we collaborated with them for a few years, giving them some of our grain, and they brewed some beer. And the growers came up with a name and a label design, so we've done 2 batches of our own beer, Growers Union. The first year we actually kind of put a little bit of grain back to mill in a little mock mill so people could get a bag, but the bulk of it really wasn't for flour. It was to kind of make sure that we had enough seed to keep growing it and getting it a little bit bigger. So I think by the sort of second, third year, we'd got a bigger pot of money, which essentially enabled us to supersize. And we had a talks program, and it was much more in person. This is Josiah Meldrum from Hodmedod's in a local bakery. So it was really still unpicking a food system, but rather than looking back to say what's wrong with this industrial system which we're all dependent on, it was more about, well, let's look at those that are doing something interesting already, alternative to this system. Let's stop looking back and critiquing, because we know this is wrong. There's no point of looking too hard at why it's wrong for that long. Let's look to kind of what's happening that's really nourishing and cultivating and healthy. So the numbers were getting bigger by this point. We actually bothered counting how many people. I think on the first year we had 200 plots, but we didn't really bother counting how many actual people were involved. That's the kind of the rush job that the first year was. It was like, when's the wheat grown? October. Oh my God, let's get it quick, get it in the ground. Let's do this project. We had like 4 weeks to do the project once we had the idea. So I think we had, what did we have? We had something like 300 plots at our peak and over 1,000 people attached to those plots. So we pimped up our amazing communication and started making, we brought some other people on board. Hannah created this amazing newspaper. So we had 2 in-print newspapers that were posted to people's houses called the Sheffield Wheat, and it had a real range of stories from not only our growers, but international, the politics, the history. We got academics involved, looking at different kind of research around millers and bakers and everything wheat related that you can imagine. And then we managed to have a much more kind of active relationship with not just individuals, but going into schools and communities. And then some community kind of groups kind of didn't have land, some had certain skills, some just wanted to grow, so there was an element of bringing different community groups together. This is a group whose job was to kind of work with women who wanted to be empowered to do their own building and construction. So they were teamed together to build their own raised beds, which then brought another community group together with land, and then they all worked together to grow the wheat. And then, of course, everyone just gets excited and does whatever they want to, which is great, as we want to encourage that. So this then also became about scarecrows for the kids to protect their wheat, because once, you invest a lot in this, right? You sow it, and then the first 3 weeks are really vulnerable. And growing small amounts, the smaller you grow, like the more vulnerable it is, in a sense. So the rituals and the kind of the period of dormancy and all of that become really important. They become a real space for thinking and reflection too. So the scarecrows were brilliant. We also started to build relationships with bakers, and rather than giving individual packets of flour, we just created some baking days where people could sign up and work with a professional baker to explore different ways of working with the flour that we was produced. But the bulk of it was still going back in the ground. And then one of the sort of final big event threshing days, we kind of went into a new barn, a huge barn, and then we kind of just set up all the different systems. One of the really great things about this, about wheat, is that it kind of brings out the geek, the tinkerer, the engineer, and despite thousands and thousands of years across the world of refining different processes, everybody knows how to do it a bit better. And everyone gets into machines, and so they dropped off their wheat, and then we had this huge barn, and we had different processes. So we not only had the sticks for bashing this year, we had bought a Victorian tiny thrasher. So we kind of drew out the different kind of histories. There was an ongoing joke that if we managed to sustain this project for 15 years, we probably would have caught up with the industrial processes. And everyone was like, oh yeah, I see why combines were invented. I can see why this all works. But hand processing has remained a massive part. And actually, after a while, this was our tiny thrasher. This was very much one of our growers was very keen on, I think we bought it for £5, but we had to spend a ton on lorries and going up to an auction, an agricultural auction, to get it back down, and then spend ages tinkering and fixing it. And actually, 2 years later, we ditched it and went back to the sticks. And also, that's invited hacks of all sorts of different technologies that are kind of already online, people doing different things on how to clean the grain. And how you clean and process the grain is the collective, tricky, complex and joyous element of wheat growing. And of course, we go into all of the traditions, this is winnowing, so this is sorting the wheat from the chaff, which is essentially done by air, and different forms of wafting. But even that goes into an immense amount of conversation of, the best ways of wafting. And the desire for this kind of widening the cultural story, both historically, but also what that means now, became really, really important. So on these events, we would invite people who had different skills that we wouldn't have. So this is a lady who came up to teach us how to weave wheat, so that there's a whole ritual around corn dolly making and different kind of processes of using the straw, which now has no economic value. So there's no thatching or very little thatching anymore. So these things have all died down because the wheat we grow now has been bred to be very short, so that it can not fall over and carry a bigger ear of wheat and be more have a greater yield. But to do that, it's utterly dependent on a whole heap of different chemical inputs. So it's bringing back to life the whole plant. And storytelling and fables and all the music and the culture that goes around it. So later on, once we started getting half-decent amounts, this is all tiny, relatively tiny for compared to a kind of average farm of wheat. But we created an event, or Hannah created a beautiful event called Our Bread, where we just invited people to come and bring their own bakes and with their own stories. And then we had lots of different people doing different demonstrations, both with other flour, but also our flour. These were gorgeous. So these were rotis from a group of women who were growing. And we would do celebrations and breaking the bread and look at different kind of historical biscuits of rituals that would have been buried along with the crop for a collective of a good harvest. So we also, I think when we got a bit bigger, as in like when we got a bit of a bigger pot of funding and we got some other people in, and the idea was that it gave me a little bit more time to start looking at the real local grain economy. So we teamed up with, this is Kimberly Bell, who's doing some amazing work in Nottingham with this alternative grain. And I was really keen on sort of starting to sow the seeds and cultivate bakers in Sheffield, just to kind of say, can we start making this a bit more real? Can we kind of get the flour in the bakeries? One of the things that we learn over this number of years is that even the most wonderful bakers, the culture of baking, even in artisan bakery, doesn't often go beyond the packet of flour to the wheat. You don't get into the field of wheat. You don't know where that wheat is grown or what's in that wheat or where, how that flour is made up. So that became a really important part of the program, which was to bring bakers together and to start exploring kind of these different wheats. And it led to a whole project with me and Kim around called the Body Lab, which kind of started to break down the industrial mindsets and the industrial logics, which in one sense we thought we were detaching ourselves from. So if you go to a small bakery and it's independent and it's absolutely wonderful and it might be sourdough, but what industrial metrics that have we embodied so deeply that we still kind of use them in those new systems? And it's so we created with Farmerama, we created a they created a three-part podcast based on our research, which was very much looking at the numbers that need to go into the quality of the wheat, so it would be the moisture and things like that, by which the miller says, okay, this is okay to mill. And the short story was that what we really started to understand is that the diversity of wheat meant that what's happened over the years is that we've had kind of this expectation that we want this kind of loaf of bread. And in order to have that kind of loaf of bread, you need a fairly consistent flour supply. And to have a fairly consistent flour supply, you need to have fairly consistent wheat. And to have fairly consistent wheat, you need to grow the same kind of wheat and try and make it in the same conditions. And if it doesn't fit that, then the millers can't mill it because they know it won't go and sell. So we've kind of got this system where we've narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And what that really means for the environment, what that really means for the farmers, is that only this wheat can work. And Kim and a few other bakers went to a mill, a big industrial mill, and said, well, could you test our wheat? Can you test these 3 different varieties? And they put them through all these amazing machines, and the technicians were wonderful. And they said, okay, well, none of these wheats would be good for baking. They're not going to pass. At which point the bakers got out 3 gorgeous loaves of bread, and they all had lunch with the bread that was the wheat that they said they couldn't bake with. And so it's this, what are the statistics, what are the metrics by which we measure good bread? And really it's about an expectation of what we think good bread is. So I just wanted to put this slide in, talking about the logics of modernity that you get stuck into. And this is where the kind of big shouty widening out of the project was started to rein in. And we'd have half an acre that we've been growing for 6 years on a market garden site called Regather's Farm. And in order to get to the threshing event, we needed to harvest the wheat and put it in a Luton van and drive it a mile down the road in order for people to come and have a go at threshing it. And it was absurd because it's like the most inefficient way you could process wheat. And also it was a really sunny year, so the grain was literally dropping. Every time you moved it, you would lose yield. It was a great event, but it was definitely a turning point by which we said, okay, the wheat's got a voice. The wheat knows what it needs. Let's start working with the wheat rather than the wheat working for the project. So this is flailing, what I mentioned earlier. We now do that on the field, and we started to invite people to the field. Once the seed was bulked up enough, we invite people to the field to join us to harvest, collectively harvest, but also to celebrate. So the marquee was hired, and we put that next to the wheat. And we had an amazing few years where we harvested on the field, but we also brought stories and music and cultural traditions and learn about things like the last corn standing and all of the rituals that had been built up, that by this point we were really understood. We started to really feel it because, what happens if the supermarkets don't supply it that year? And in 2020, this started when there was, gaps of flour coming on the supermarket shelves. And we started to get a slightly stronger, sort of tangible sense of what it was to be dependent on each other, dependent on the seed and dependent on the soil. And these cultures, these rituals, these kind of markings and moments actually became quite significant. So, just to start to bring to a close, keep you up to speed. The market garden at Regather is still where we grow our main crop. It's half an acre. We've just sown our 6th year. Since the beginning of the project, there's a nationwide group of plant breeders, farmers, bakers, and activists and artists work together and have worked with DEFRA to get a temporary experiment license, and we are now in our 4th year of legally being able to sow this kind of seed as an experiment to see if this can if the infrastructure and the things can be put in place to make it work. There's grain alliances have been born all around, were happening before this project, but around the UK, where different people are coming together to start trialling and growing and working with farmers and bakers and actually growing and stocking this grain. And we have 2 bakeries in Sheffield who now regularly stock, which is great. And one's near my house, which is really great. And these 2 lovely ladies, there's a big poster that sits in my studio, and they look over me every day with very stern eyes. And I think, so when I was invited to do this talk, I was also invited to reflect on this idea of against the odds. And it was a kind of a big, how do you, it's quite a big question, isn't it, really? And I could pitch this in different places, but I thought, when I think about this project and what's really important about this project, and I've always kind of teetered into this bit, and other people involved in the project kind of have slightly different views, but where you pitch it in terms of what it's trying to do and how real it is and how tangible it is and how much change you think you can make, it's always this kind of tricky kind of balance of kind of this desire to wanting to fix and make change, but then kind of being overwhelmed by this systemic problem, right? Really complex, massive systemic problem that's just not going to be fixed in that same way as we would like to think it could be if we just change this and just change this. It's deep, deep inequalities in the food system. It's deep, deep inequalities in who has power and who owns seed, who owns chemicals, and why we've got into this place in the first, how we've got here in the industrial system. So really, for me, what it always comes back to is reconnection, you know, and in a way, one of the reasons of scaling down is kind of, and slowing down, is that that's possibly the best thing we can do, in the sense of really focusing on reconnecting with the seed, and that seed goes back to our ancestors. These people held that seed that grows the wheat that then becomes our wheat, and carving out time to really take that in, to start experiencing and understanding and maybe thinking more deeply about what it was to live in those different times, what relationships they had to the food, what didn't work then, but what are we missing now by not hand harvesting, or what are we missing now by being so disconnected and only seeing food as a commodity to consume. It's about reconnection to the land and the interdependencies of each other. Hand harvesting that we do is done in gang systems. You have a tier of at least 6 people. You have the reaper, you have the binder, you have the kids who kind of like make a little bit of rope, which then binds the sheaf. Then you have the sheaf tied, and then they stook. We're all on the field doing that together. You get on a train and go down the country, you just see absence in the monoculture of these wheat fields. There's no people in them. So that's another form of disconnection. So reconnection to be on the land is really important. And more recently, reconnection for those who are refugees and asylum seekers who actually still probably have experienced that in their land, their home where they came from, where it's much more likely that they grew up seeing the wheat fields and the hand harvesting. And we've had people on our field showing us different winnowing techniques that we could never do, and we showed them our flailing techniques, and they were like, no, that's not how you do it. And this constant battle of kind of evolving the processing. So I think really for us, it's about really getting close and experiencing and reconnecting and practicing an alternative to the dominant system. It's not about fixing or problem solving. It's about letting go a little bit, but just about relating and practicing. And year on year, we learn more, because don't forget, we only harvest once a year. So we've only practiced 6 times, and it's taken us 6 years to learn only a tiny bit. And only now are we getting kind of understanding the absolute skill, what seems like a really basic thing, reaping and all of this stuff. We had years and years and years of uninterrupted ancestral knowledge of practice, and we absolutely kind of just stopped it. And now by doing it, we're starting to re-pick that up, and it feels like it's reconnecting back to a time that we kind of once knew and we still hold somewhere within us. We know that it's unlikely that we are going to see our seed, or this kind of seed, become the dominant system. But there will be pockets of collapse. There already are. If you look at the wars that have gone on, you look at the different crises in weather, extreme weather, the monoculture system will not survive. And there's going to be gaps, and there's going to be pockets of non-supply. And for us, if we can start practicing this alternative process, maybe we will get closer to understanding and bringing that skill to a point that when those gaps are there, that there will be another way possible presented, that we can not start from scratch, but that we can build on the small amounts of work that's being done. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth. I really want to leave it there. I think that sums up our day perfectly. So a final thank you to everyone for playing their role today as participant or speaker or chair. A final invitation to join us online tomorrow or continue the conversation by email, or if you can join us for a drink. Let's keep working together against the odds. Thank you.